All DACs sound the same. That's what some people will tell you. After all, if you measure the frequency response of almost any modern DAC on the market today, it's going to have a flat frequency response from 20 Hz all the way to 20 kHz. However, not only is that a small part of the total sound of a device like a DAC, it's actually a very small and largely insignificant part of the sound of the device, assuming there's no huge major flaws in the frequency response, of course. What's far more important in the world of DACs is the timing of the information. How effectively the DAC is able to recreate the exact and minute timing variations of the complex audio signal that is music. And how precisely that's delivered is down to a few different factors. Perhaps the most important of these factors is the filtering used during the process of converting the digital data into the analog waveform. For those not familiar with DACs and how they work internally, almost all modern DACs are doing what's called upsampling of the sound, or oversampling it's sometimes called. That means they're taking the data from your streamer, your computer, or maybe your CD transport, and they're calculating additional data points within the waveform to improve the accuracy of the recreated analog waveform. To be clear, this process is not about adding any data that wasn't already there, it's about becoming more accurate with the data that is already there, better predicting the exact path that the sound wave took between sample A and sample B. This process helps to improve the timing accuracy of the DAC by creating a more precise pathway for the ups and downs of the sound signal. The oversampling or upsampling process also serves to push the noise created by the conversion process further into the inaudible bandwidths, way beyond what we can hear. The whole process is probably incorrectly lumped together and called filtering by laypeople like me. That oversimplification is due to the fact that this process involves a series of very complex mathematical equations in order to extract the maximum accuracy in the output waveform while also filtering away the noise generated by the process. And the reason all of this is important to discuss and why it's relevant here is that the DAC chips like the ES9039 Pro used within the Gustard X30 are generally fairly mediocre at doing this job. Although perhaps mediocre is a little bit too strong of a word, but the point is that when you hear other DAC designs like those from Chord using FPGAs, in other words programmable chips, or when you hear what Schiit Audio do with their multibit DACs, you start to understand the differences. Both of those brands, Chord and Schiit Audio, along with a number of other brands, do a phenomenal job of maintaining timing accuracy. And the result in those cases, or I should say in all cases because there are other brands doing it really well too, the result is always a much better soundstage and imaging experience. You get more depth in the soundstage as the timing gets better and better, and you also get a more three-dimensional sense of sound for each individual instrument. Compare that to the plethora of DACs on the market using off-the-shelf DAC chips, and what you hear from those DACs is a flat wall of sound, something that's far more like a reproduction of music as opposed to the live experience of listening to a performer there in front of you. Lately though, things have begun to change. We've had various R2R DACs from brands like Live, Denafrips and Hollow Audio. We've also had the 1-bit designs from Topping Audio, with the D900 being an amazing example. These other brands have shown that there are many different ways to achieve excellent timing performance in these sometimes affordable and sometimes flagship DACs. And then Gustard decided to release a flagship DAC in the form of the X30 that uses 4 of the off-the-shelf ES9039 Pro DAC chips. It's a nice DAC chip for sure, but even with 4 of them, it's never going to catch the likes of Schiit Audio, Chord, or Live for 3 examples. That is, unless those 4 DAC chips are then paired up with a different DSP chip with custom filtering to apply to it. And that is what Gustard did, and the results are phenomenal. However, before you get too excited, Gustard also then went and one-upped themselves. Since releasing the X30, they've now also released the R30, which is an R2R DAC with a different set of filters, but otherwise a very similar DAC design. And so the questions rain down. Firstly, are the Gustard DACs really worth considering against other flagship competition? And if they are worth considering, is it worth spending extra to get the R30 over the slightly more affordable X30? I reached out to Shenzhen Audio and they were kind enough to send me both the R30 and the X30 so I could compare the two of them for you. That's a big investment on their part, so I want to say a huge thanks to Shenzhen Audio. And I'd also like to encourage you to consider buying from Shenzhen Audio next time you're going to make a purchase. Doing so is a great way that they're able to continue to afford supporting reviewers such as me and others in the industry to share with you information like this. Importantly though, I want to clarify that Shenzhen Audio are not sponsoring this video. They have no influence over this video. And it was just that I was so impressed that they would send me two DACs at this level that are so very similar in order to help me share it with you. And so everything you're about to hear is my thoughts on these two DACs with no influence from them, and that will probably become pretty evident shortly. But while we're talking about the contribution from Shenzhen Audio, we should also talk about the cost of these DACs. The X30 retails for $2,999 and the R30 with its more complex R2R design retails for $3,600. These are clearly not DACs that are going to fit everybody's budget, but I think you might be surprised with the performance they deliver at the price you pay for them. I'll describe all of that for you in a moment, but first let's briefly talk about the differences between these two so we can start to understand them better. As I've already said, the X30 at $3,000 uses 4 ES9039 Pro DAC chips from ESS. Those DAC chips are then paired up with an Analog Devices Shark chip, which handles the DSP for the custom filters. It's not DSP in the sense that it's not messing with the signal, it's just doing the same filtering process that is done by every DAC on the market, unless it's a non-oversampling design, but it's doing it in a customized way that the Gustard engineers feel is going to deliver the best sound. And that comes back to the timing accuracy we spoke about before. The $3,600 R30 DAC uses resistor ladders to do the decoding. It's an R2R DAC. It also has custom filters, but it seems to be a different set of filters than the ones used in the X30 because it's coming out of a different type of decoding process. But then if we go beyond the decoding and filtering differences between these DACs, they're otherwise essentially identical. We have twin toroidal transformers inside each DAC. One of those feeds the analog circuits of the DAC, the other feeds the digital circuits of the DAC. There are then discrete analog low-pass filters and output stages, and that just means they're using individual components like transistors, resistors, and capacitors, which allows them to really carefully tune the sound of the DACs rather than using an off-the-shelf op-amp chip. Both DACs have resistor ladder volume controls, meaning that you're getting really precise level-matched volume control if you want to adjust the volume from your DAC, and that means you can send the signal from these straight into a power amp or into a pair of active speakers if you don't want to worry about things like preamps. And then to add even more value, just like the lower priced R26 that I reviewed quite some time ago, the X30 and R30 also feature a built-in streaming stage. The streamers in these DACs are wired only, meaning there's no Wi-Fi, but with an RJ45 connection, you have access to using the R30 or the X30 as a Roon endpoint, as a Spotify Connect endpoint, a DLNA endpoint for UPnP software like say Bubble UPnP. It can also be an HQ Player endpoint if you use HQ Player. And then there's also Apple AirPlay 2. As we look a bit deeper into the marketing, the R30 marketing also talks about it having a discrete 1-bit decoding stage for DSD signals. And whilst that's not also a point of emphasis in the X30 marketing, my listening test would suggest that either the X30 and the R30 use the same DSD processing circuit, or that the ES9039 Pro DAC chips in the X30 do the same essential job as the 1-bit processors in the R30 DAC. And what I mean by all that, if none of that made sense to you, is that if you're playing DSD into both of these DACs, they basically sound identical. And so we've got two DACs here with very similar designs beyond the core of their actual decoding circuitry. So the power supply design is similar, the output stages are similar, the volume controls are similar. And then when we bring that to the outside, the externals of these are extremely similar as well. In fact, the only way you can tell the difference at a glance to the front panel of these devices is that the X30 has a triangular section around the logo and power button on the front of the DAC, whereas the R30 has a rounded section in the same place. And then if we look at the back of both DACs, they're identical on the backs as well. You've got a pair of XLR, a pair of RCA, you've then got your usual USB-B, coaxial, optical, there's AES, and there's also 2 I2S connections as well. And so aesthetically, both DACs are essentially identical. They're available in black or silver in both cases as far as I understand. And they're also both pretty hefty DACs when it comes to size and weight. So factor that in, make sure you've got space for one of these. They're not little. And then what all of that means when we get to this point is that really the only way for you to decide which of these 2 DACs is right for you, if either of them are, is to think about which one you prefer the sound of, and or if one of them is just too much for your budget. If the R30 is just that stretch too far and you want to save a little bit of money, then the X30 is the choice. But if budget's not an issue, it's all going to come down to sound. And to test these DACs, in order to tell you what I thought about how each one sounded, I first needed to work out how to compare them to one another. One of the challenges I had when testing these was that I didn't have a source that could output 2 identical connections into both the X30 and the R30 at the same time. And so I ended up playing around a little bit to try to find 2 different inputs that were essentially comparable. What I landed on was sending an I2S input into one of the DACs, coming from the live micro DDC, which was being fed via USB from my computer, and then I had the other DAC using its internal streamer. After lots and lots of testing, those 2 inputs were the closest in sound quality I could possibly find, and I also switched the 2 between the 2 DACs to make sure that it wasn't going to be lopsided in one direction. And on that note, the question as to which input on these DACs is going to sound best is actually going to be more about the products and devices you're connecting into them rather than the DAC itself. What I mean by that is that, for example, if you have a really high quality transport that only has AES, that's going to sound better than giving it a lower quality input from something with I2S. To put it yet another way, what I'm saying here is you should choose the input based on what sources you have and what sounds best in your particular setup, as opposed to worrying too much about which input on the DAC might be the best. There are too many other factors to consider, and all of the inputs on the Gustard X30 and R30 have the potential to sound fantastic if fed from a high quality upstream source. And so once I then got to directly comparing the R30 and the X30, in some particular configurations they're indistinguishable from each other, but in other configurations they're quite different. Using what's called the linear sharp filter on the R30 and the vivid filter on the X30 provides an image that's a little bit more tightly focused. On the R30, the edges of each sound get a little tiny bit more diffuse. How I hear that is that I think the transients, the accuracy of those tiny timing elements in the sound are just a little bit less accurate from the R30 than they are from the X30. But again, that's based on what I'm hearing, no measurements or anything that I can tell you. And when I'm saying transients, what I'm referring to there are the absolute minute original moments of each sound. Think about the microsecond when a drumstick hits the skin of a snare drum, as opposed to maybe the extra 1 second of sound that occurs with the rest of the resonance of that drum. Those tiny fractions of seconds at the beginning of sounds are actually vital to our auditory system's ability to understand the sound, its placement in space, its size, its shape, everything there is to know about it. And so with the X30, you get a tighter, more precise sense of where each sound is in space, and even a slightly better sense of the exact size and shape of the sound. But with the R30, each note takes on a slightly more substantial and fuller sense of presence. What I mean by that is the images, the individual instruments seem just a little bit larger in space. That also tends to make the R30 sound just a little bit warmer or richer than the X30. It's only by a very small margin, and the difference here is not about overall tonality, it's about the sharpness of those transients, and even sharpness is the wrong word. It's about the precision of those transients. The X30 is not a sharp, harsh or aggressive sounding DAC, it's just more precise than the R30 to my ears. Another way you could think about it, if it helps, is that I would describe the R30 as having a slightly softer sound. And I don't mean quieter, just that it's a bit less energetic and a little bit less precise. As I move through the 3 different filters on the R30, it basically goes from being as precise as it gets, which is very good with the linear sharp filter, to get gradually softer and more diffuse. So you've got the minimum slow filter is just a little bit softer than the linear sharp, and then it goes softer still with what they call the super slow filter. And so for those seeking a super laid-back sound, the super slow filter on the R30 could be just the ticket. But I personally preferred the sound of the R30 with the linear sharp filter. And keep in mind that some of this is going to come down to your system. I've got a very clean and precise but not harsh system with my Proact Response D2R speakers and a Burson Soloist Voyager preamp with the Timekeeper Voyager monoblocks. And so in my system, the R30 with the linear sharp filter is the best balance of richness, fullness, and precision. That's how I like it, but the nice thing is you can choose how you like it. However, before we get too carried away about how much I like the R30 sound, it's worth pointing out that I actually prefer the sound of the cheaper X30. And this is what I was referring to when I said before that Shenzhen Audio have no influence over this video. I'm not going to recommend that you should go out and buy the more expensive DAC here, because I actually think the X30 is a little bit better, to my tastes and in my system anyway. I really like the sense of precision and focus the X30 can deliver, and even more than that, I love the fact that by changing the filters, you can make the X30 sound just like the R30 in its more precise versions. So if you compare the R30 with that linear sharp filter, which makes the R30 its most precise but still a bit laid back, you can get that exact same sound with what's called the composite filter on the X30. Just like the R30, the X30 has 3 different filters to choose from. We've already talked about the vivid filter, which is the most precise. There's the composite filter, which is a little bit less precise. And you can still make it even more laid back again with what's called the gentle filter. And so essentially, the reason I prefer the X30 overall is that you can have it become a very precise, clean, but still very natural and organic sounding DAC, or you can make it a more laid back DAC by just changing the filter settings. And that's where it's going to come back to your personal preferences and your specific system that you're putting it into. As I've already said, I like the X30 the most in its vivid mode, but the composite mode does sound excellent too, particularly if you've got a slightly more aggressive set of speakers or a room that's maybe a little bit brighter. They're all things that you'll need to factor into it, but you have the choice. And to give you an idea of just how exceptional I think the X30 and the R30 sound, my first instinct when I got them here was to compare them to the almost $15,000 Chord DAVE DAC. I tested the DAVE with and without the Chord M scaler included, but in each case it was always being fed by the Eversolo T8 as the streamer, and that was always connected to the M scaler with the tubulars consensus USB cable, and then the M scaler can either pass on the signal with or without upsampling applied. In contrast, the X30 was being fed by its own internal streaming circuit, which is very, very good, especially if you're feeding it with a high quality network signal, which I have here thanks to an old Ether regen unit. And so we've got a high quality network going into the X30, we've got a high quality streamer feeding into the Chord DAVE and M scaler, and that's how I compared the two devices. Both DACs were connected to the Soloist Voyager preamp, as I mentioned before, and that was via 2 pairs of Ri-Cable Invictus reference XLR cables, before the signal went to the Timekeeper Voyager monoblocks and out to the Proact Response D2R speakers via the Tellurium Q Black version 2 speaker cables. And as I listened to both setups, I was honestly shocked over and over and over again to hear just how close the X30, and probably the X30 slightly more than the R30, but both of them could get so close to the sound of the Chord DAVE. I've chatted to a Patreon member who's also bought the X30 at my recommendation and who also already had the Chord DAVE, and we've both agreed that we could easily live without the DAVE DAC by just having an X30. Without the M scaler throwing upsampling into the mix, the X30 comes across just a little tiny bit warmer and smoother than the DAVE, which in turn is just a little bit drier sounding, but also a little bit more textured and detailed sounding. In areas like staging and imaging, these two DACs are basically identical. Where the DAVE does pull ahead a little bit is that it provides just a tiny bit of extra nuance or fine detail in the sound. You'll get a better sense of the ambience of the room or the finest textures of the breath of a vocalist. That's really the only way the DAVE pulls ahead. So the DAVE is a little bit better, but it's a very small margin. Of course, if you then add upsampling via the M scaler into the DAVE, the sense of soundstage size and separation of sounds further improves. Again, that's all about that timing accuracy we spoke about earlier, but you can get much the same results with the R30 and the X30 by switching them into the non-oversampling modes, or turning off the filters essentially, and then you can feed it with a software like HQ Player. You won't ever get them to quite the same level as the DAVE, but the point is that whilst the DAVE can scale up with the Chord M scaler, so too the Gustards can scale up with HQ Player. And so the gap remains consistent whether or not you're upsampling. And so yes, I have absolutely, on multiple occasions since getting the X30, considered selling off the DAVE and the M scaler. If not for the noticeable extra degree of insight that the DAVE can deliver on a high-end system, it would have been a made decision by now. And what that means for you, and the point of me saying that, is that if you're not using a really high-end system, there's no point going to something like the DAVE because the X30 is just that good. And to put that into more of a numerical perspective, I would estimate that you have to spend about the same cost as the DAVE, which is around about $15,000 on the rest of your system before it becomes worth even thinking about the DAVE. And realistically, you're probably going to want to spend even more to get the most out of it. And so what I'm really saying here is that you could go out and buy yourself an X30 or an R30 and use the money that you've saved from buying something like the Chord DAVE into better other components, whether they're speakers, amplifiers, preamps, headphones, whatever makes sense to you. And then on a quick side note, for those that like using DSD, whether it's through upsampling or native DSD files, both the X30 and the R30 sound fantastic with DSD. It actually probably closes the gap even closer to the Chord DAVE, which does still win, but it's a very tight battle. And so we probably could wrap things up here, but I suspect what I've told you so far has raised the same questions for you that it did for me, which is just how good are the X30 and the R30 when compared to the other competition at around the same price? Because there is some excellent competition out there. One such source of competition is the amazing Schiit Yggdrasil DAC. I have the More is Better version that is no longer available. It's been replaced, I think, by the Singularity version. And when the version I have here was available, from memory, it was just a little bit less in terms of retail price than the X30. And so I decided to try the Iggy More is Better up against the X30. And straight away, what I heard was two brilliant DACs. But I also heard that the X30 was delivering just a little bit more sense of depth in the soundstage and space between sounds. On the other hand, the Iggy is a little bit more forward with its sound. It brings the soundstage closer to you, and there's less overall depth, so things are relatively flatter. The Iggy is not a flat sounding DAC by any stretch, but it did go to show me that the X30 stretches deeper and has more sense of space overall. And in fact, the best way I can describe it without going over a whole lot of the same ground again is that going from the Iggy to the X30 is very similar to the experience of going from the X30 to the DAVE, where the X30 is noticeably just a step ahead in the nuance, the fine details, the sense of room ambience and space. But the Iggy is still an excellent DAC, of course, and remember that the Iggy I've got here is now technically out of date, so don't compare what I've said about it to whatever is happening with the new Singularity version. That might be different still. And so the X30 proved once again that it really is an excellent DAC. It has a bit more nuance, a bit more space, and just a little bit more sense of refinement than what I was hearing from the Iggy. But at the same time, because audio is such a personal thing, some might hear the Iggy as being more energetic and more detailed because it does bring the sound a bit forward. So some might like that, but I think most people will hear the nuance, the control and the refinement, the sense of space that the X30 delivers, and consider it the better DAC as well. And so all of that brought me to what I think is the toughest competition for the X30 to overcome. And that's excluding the DAVE, because the DAVE was an impossible hill to climb, or it should have been, and yet the X30 got really, really close. A more realistic comparison, one that is actually also a bit of an underdog, is the topping D900. It's cheaper than the X30, but it's beaten multiple more expensive DACs that I put it up against. At just a little bit under the $2,000 mark, the topping D900 is seriously impressive. It does all of those things we've spoken about already in terms of spaciousness, soundstage size, imaging focus, all of that. In other words, it's doing a great job of timing accuracy. And when I compared the D900 to the Gustard X30, these DACs were very similar in their presentations. I'd say that the soundstage size, imaging focus, and general technical presentation of the D900 was closer to the X30 than what the Schiit Yggdrasil did. And indeed, if you're only thinking about things like the size, shape, and general imaging characteristics of the soundstage, the X30 and the D900 are probably indistinguishable. However, on this occasion, where the X30 is able to pull ahead is with its sense of insight and detail in the sound. And I don't mean detail in the sense of a hyped up clarity. It doesn't push anything forward at you, but it's like you're more able to hear into the music. It's like the musicians are closer to you or more present in the room with you. Another way to put it is that when I switched from the D900 across to the X30, it was like a bit of a veil was removed from between me and the musicians. Everything just became a little bit more tangible and lifelike with the X30. And so unless you happen to need the dual XLR outputs on the D900, as I sometimes do, I think the X30 is clearly the superior DAC and definitely worth spending the extra money on. And then to take that an extra step further, I think the Gustard X30 and R30 are probably the two very best DACs you can buy on the market right now for around about that $3,000 mark. I would have loved to include in this testing the amazing linear tube Aero DAC, because that's another one that performs extremely well for a little bit more money than the X30 and the R30, but unfortunately due to a sick dog that was a bit touch and go and is actually in surgery at the time that I'm recording this video, my time's been a bit limited this week. So my prayers go out to little rascal at the time that I'm recording this, and at the same time my apologies to you that I can't tell you exactly how the X30 or the R30 compare to the linear tube Aero DAC. However, as always, if I get a flood of comments down below and lots of hits of the like button as well, I'll be sure to make a separate video on that one if people want it. What I can tell you with certainty though at this point is that whether you were to choose the linear tube audio Aero DAC or either of these Gustard X30 or R30 DACs, you're not going to go wrong. They are all absolutely fantastic. And to bring things right back into focus on the Gustards, they are insane for the price. When it then comes down to splitting between the two Gustards, I would choose the X30, of course, if you're budget limited, and or if you prefer a slightly more focused and precise sound. It's not a harsh or clinical or in any way fatiguing sound, it just focuses everything better. But on the other hand, if you know that you prefer a slightly more laid back sound, maybe the rest of your system is a little bit too energetic, then the Gustard R30 is also absolutely fantastic. And if you've decided to buy either of these, please don't forget to consider using the link in the description down below to buy them through Shenzhen Audio as a way of saying thank you to them for their investment in this video and making it possible. It's very unusual for brands to send out two devices at the same time like this with such high value, and I really appreciate them doing so. And now to wrap all this up, I pinned a video here at the end that you'll definitely want to watch if you want to understand why timing is so important and why DACs like the X30 and the R30 sound so much better than other DACs built on generic chips without custom filters. So watch that one next, but for now, and as always, peace, love and music, and I'll see you here again soon.